thanks for joining us. For more great content like this, visit polishingthepulpit.com or search for Polishing the Pulpit in your favorite podcast app. Also, be sure to check out PTP 365 for thousands of more videos just like this. You can learn more by visiting 365.polishingthepulpit.com, and to make it easy for you, we've put a link in this video's description. Let's sing a song and study together.
Thank you for joining us for this session. We're going to be discussing the skeptics' or atheists' claim that God is not required for morality. Of course, we Christians believe that God is required for morality. First, I would like to discuss what we as Christians mean when we say that God is required for morality, and then I'll discuss what the atheist or the skeptic means when he says God is not required for morality. There are certain things that we as Christians are not saying when we say that God is required for morality. For example, we are not claiming that it's impossible for an atheist or a skeptic to act morally. Certainly there are many people who are opposed to the Bible and yet do many moral actions, and we would affirm that. We would appreciate that. We would certainly not deny it. Nor would we say that it is impossible for an atheist or a skeptic to come to believe or to teach some objective moral values and duties. In fact, there are many atheists and skeptics who believe and teach many values and dictates of morality with which Christians would largely agree. We are not claiming that it's impossible for an atheist or a skeptic to even develop a moral theory based upon his or her moral beliefs that teaches many good and wholesome objective moral values and duties. So notice what we've said. We are not claiming that atheists are incapable of doing good things. We're not claiming that atheists are incapable of coming to believe in objective morality, nor are we claiming that atheists are incapable of developing theories that would inculcate good moral values and duties. Christians are claiming that God is required for morality in this sense. First, God is required as the creator of all human beings and of all things other than human beings in order to make human morality possible. That is, God exists as the creator, the one who makes possible all things other than himself. He upholds the universe by the word of his power, Hebrews 1 and verse 3 says. Colossians 1, 16 and 17, John 1, 1 through 4, Genesis 1. Many passages teach that God is responsible for the creation and the sustaining of everything other than himself. And so in this sense, we would say God is required for morality in the same sense in which God is required for tomatoes, or in the same sense in which God is required for cells. God is required to make any of those things possible. But then also we would say God is necessary for morality in the sense that God is implicated in all of our claims about what is right and wrong, about what is good and evil. That is, when we say that something is objectively right, or objectively wrong, objectively good, objectively evil, we're making reference to the divine lawgiver. Think about that word objective for just a moment. The objectivity of morals is referencing the fact that morality is what it is, independent of what we take it to be. In other words, things are right or wrong even if everybody disagrees with their rightness or wrongness. Just to give an illustration, we might think about the Nazi war criminals at the end of World War II, who argued that they had not broken any laws. They had not broken German laws because German laws allowed them to do what they did. They had not violated British law. They weren't British. They didn't live there. They had not violated American laws. You could make a case that there are many laws that they had not violated, and that the laws that did apply to them were actually permitting them to do what they did. And so we might ask the question, what laws did they violate? And you'll remember that the Chief Justice for the United States, who was presiding, said that they had violated a higher law, one that was above the provincial and the transient. In other words, they violated a law that's applicable to all people at all times, whether the people agree with those laws or not. This is what we mean when we say morality is objective. That is, it's not something that people create for themselves. That moral norms are not something that we make up in our own culture, in our own home, in our own heart, but rather they're things we discover in the world. We discover many things in the world, such as trees and bugs and buildings and people. And we also discover as we go through our lives that there are moral absolutes. There are norms that are objective. Some of these we learn by just observing how people behave, but we ultimately learn these things from God's Word, because God has given us not only a general revelation, which arguably includes some moral teaching, but also a special revelation of His mind and precisely what He expects in human behavior. So when Christians say God is required for morality, we're saying God is the one who makes everything possible by virtue of His creation and His sustaining of those things. And then we're also saying, and this is where we'll spend most of our time in this session, that God is implicated in our moral claims. When we say that there is objective right and wrong, objective good and evil, we're referencing the law of the divine lawgiver. Our position about this could be stated in the form of a syllogism. You know what a syllogism is, a deductive syllogism? It's an argument wherein if the two premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Let me give you an example. Here is a sample syllogism. The first premise is, all men are mortal. The second premise is, Socrates is a man. And the conclusion is, Socrates is mortal. You will observe that the conclusion just sort of falls out of the premises. If you believe in the premises, you have obligated yourself logically to believe in the conclusion. You can't imagine someone saying, now I believe that all men are mortal, and I believe that Socrates is a man, but I do not believe that Socrates is mortal. You would say that somebody like that was experiencing some kind of deficiency in his rationality, and he might need to have a checkup. You would say that person is being irrational. If he admits all men are mortal, he admits Socrates is a man, but he denies that Socrates is mortal, there's something going wrong in his reasoning process. That's a sample syllogism. Let's think about our claim that God is required for morality as part of another syllogism, which we might call the argument for the existence of God from human morality, or the moral argument for the existence of God. There exists a variety of moral arguments for God's existence. I'm adapting the one that you see on the screen now from the American philosopher and theologian William Lane Craig, and I think this is an effective way of stating the moral argument for the existence of God. Let's go over it together briefly, and then we'll discuss how an atheist or a skeptic might object to this argument. The first premise is, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties are not real, or they are illusory. The second premise is, objective moral values and duties are real. And the conclusion is, therefore, God exists. Remember what we said about objective moral values and duties. If these values and duties are objective, then it means they are binding on all people at all times. Everybody is obligated to follow these duties, to believe in these values, even if they are unaware of them, and even if they were to disagree with them. For example, even if the Nazis had succeeded in winning World War II and eradicating everybody who disagreed with them, or convincing everybody who disagreed with them that they were actually right, what they did in committing the murder of 6 million Jews and others in the Holocaust would still have been wrong. Notice, even if there were universal consensus among people about what the Nazis did being right, what they did would actually still be wrong. And that's what we mean when we say that there is an objective value or that there is objective duty. There is an intrinsic value associated with human life. And what was committed in the Holocaust violated the intrinsic value of human life. So here is objective value and duty. Let's distinguish between those two terms a little bit to make sure we all understand why we're using both the term value and the term duty. Value refers to something being good or something being not good. And the word duty refers to our obligations. And you might think that those two words are totally synonymous, that they mean exactly the same thing. That's not actually true because there are some good things that we could do that are not obligatory upon us. For example, it would be good for a person to be married. The Bible teaches the value of marriage. But then also, it's not required for a person to be married. Someone can go to heaven being a married person or, in fact, being a single person. And so while it's good to be married, it's not required. Or we might say there are good things about living in this country. There are good things about living in another country. It would be good to live in this one or in that one. And God doesn't require us to live in one country or another. He's left a measure of discretion to us. So there is a difference between the value of something and our obligations. We might say that it would be good for a person to choose this profession, work in this field, and it would be also good for a person to work in this field or choose this profession. And God may not have required us to participate in either one of these, even though both of them are good. So you see the difference between value and obligation. What we're saying is that there are some things that are objectively good, objectively valuable, and that these are rooted in the nature of God. And because God's nature gives us our divine commands that we must follow, our duties, our obligations, and also our permissions proceed from the nature of God. All of our objective morality is grounded in the nature and therefore the commands of God. We might call this a divine command theory of ethics. And in short, we might summarize it by saying we must do what the Bible says. The first premise of the argument says, if God does not exist, if there's no such thing as God, then objective moral values and duties are not real. They are illusory. And the second premise says, objective moral values and duties are real. And the Bible teaches us that they are real. Also, we can experience that they are real by observing our moral intuitions. We can make appeals to atheists and skeptics based upon our moral intuitions, as we're going to do in this lesson. So, here's the argument. How would a skeptic attack this argument? Remember, if a skeptic admits that the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. And by virtue of a person being an atheist or a skeptic, he wants to deny that the conclusion is true. So, given that this is a deductive syllogism, if he's going to deny the conclusion that God exists, he's going to have to dispute one of the premises. So let's discuss briefly now how an atheist or a skeptic might do that. In the first place, an atheist might dispute the first premise. And he would say, perhaps, and this is what most of them say, objective moral values and duties are real, even though God is not real. An atheist observes that we have a very strong intuitive appeal to believe in objective moral values and duties, even though the atheist or skeptic wants to deny that we can know that God exists. For example, notice the words of Jack Healy, who was the former director of Amnesty International. He said, "I think you share my profound belief that there are indeed some moral absolutes. When it comes to torture, to government-sanctioned murder, to disappearances, these are no lesser evils. These are outrages against all of us." I bring him up not to say that I agree with everything that Jack Healy would teach or profess, but observe in this statement, which was in a fundraising letter that he sent out to various people, he made an appeal to their sense of moral oughtness and to their understanding that there are some actions that are objectively wrong, that they are indeed outrages. I suppose he would use the biblical word abomination if it could make the point any stronger, because he would say that these things are wrong no matter who commits them, no matter who might agree with doing those actions, they're still wrong. Even if everybody were to disagree or were to agree that doing those actions were permissible, it would still be wrong. You see, there's a very strong intuitive appeal associated with objective morality. But if we're going to deny the existence of God, we need another explanation for how and why we feel the strong pull of moral absolutes. Where did it come from, if not from God? The skeptic or the atheist is going to appeal basically to a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, evolution or natural selection is responsible for giving us this mechanism of appreciating moral oughtness. And then societal conditioning made possible by natural selection, by evolution, by Darwinian principles makes it possible. So evolution has produced a creature that is capable of self-reflection, of ascribing praise and blame to given actions. And then society has conditioned that creature to think that certain things are right or wrong. We might call this a herd mentality. That's not the theist word, that's the atheist word. Consider, for example, the language of the British philosopher of the 20th century, Bertrand Russell. He says, ethics arises from the pressures of the community on the individual. Man does not always instinctively feel the desires which are useful to his herd. The herd, being anxious that the individual should act in its interests, that is, in the interests of the herd, has invented various devices for causing the individual's interests to be in harmony with that of the herd. One of these is morality. But of course, this position, that evolution, natural selection, biological chance processes have produced morality in conjunction with various communities, pressures, societal norms that have been invented and then imposed upon other people. That position is very difficult to maintain. There are several reasons for this. One is that a rational consensus of people is not the same as objectivity. For example, let's just suppose that we could get everybody on earth to sign a contract that says such and such action, action X, maybe we put rape in the blank, or maybe we put killing of innocent people for no good reason, or maybe we put theft, or put whatever moral wrong you like in the blank. And we get everybody on earth to sign a contract to say, we disagree with this action. We think it is wrong. We think it is objectively wrong. And everybody is in agreement That would be nice, of course, if everybody would agree that the things the Bible says are wrong really are wrong, or if we could get everybody to believe that what the Bible teaches is right is actually right. Just suppose, for the sake of argument, we could get unanimity. We could get universal consent to some particular moral code, simple as it may be. Even if we could achieve that, objectivity would not have been produced. Even if everybody agrees, it still is a human construction. It is still a convention that is the result of various people getting together and doing some self-reflection and deciding for themselves what they think is right or wrong. What, morally speaking, is to prohibit a person from backing out of the contract and saying, oh, I revoke my signature. I really don't want to go along with this. Perhaps it's a very powerful person who decides that it's not in his best interest to keep the rule. Maybe there are some people who he would like to kill. Or maybe there are some things that other people own that he would like to possess. And so, morally speaking, given a situation where there is no God, there is just the agreement of people, why should someone feel that he is objectively obligated to keep the rules? If he's powerful enough to get away with breaking the rules, if it seems best in his own self-interest to break the rules, then there seems to me no reason why he should feel objectively obligated to keep the rules that the people have agreed to. In the same way that the Nazis did not feel obligated to keep to some generally accepted morality outside of Germany. They followed Germany's rules and they thought they were doing the right thing based upon their own self-interest. That's one reason why this objection to our first premise is so difficult to maintain, because it mistakes rational consistency or rational consensus for objective obligation. And that is a bad mistake. Another problem with the objection to our first premise is this. Evolution, which involves natural selection. You remember natural selection as a fundamental part of Darwin's theory as proposed in The Origin of Species back in the 19th century. Evolution with natural selection selects attributes of biological creatures for the purpose of survival and not for the purpose of producing true beliefs. If you know anything at all about evolution, you know that the theory suggests that over time, animals develop through mutations, through the introduction of new genetic information. Animals develop structures that make them better suited for survival. That's the theory. And we could go into a discussion of why we disagree with that theory and why we disagree with Darwinism and even neo-Darwinism, but we'll leave that for another time. For the purposes of our discussion today, just notice the goal of natural selection, or the purpose of it, according to Darwinism and even according to neo-Darwinists. The purpose is to develop stronger creatures, physically capable creatures who are better suited to survive than their competitors. It's not designed, evolution is not purposed to produce truth. It's not purposed to produce true beliefs in the minds of those creatures that evolution produces. I say that because given naturalism, given organic evolution, given natural selection, there is no warrant for the truth of our claims about morality. I mean, on what basis would we say that our beliefs about morality, even if we all agree with them, on what basis would we say they're true? There is no basis on evolution. It's just the result of cells and tissues and random chance processes that have produced some very strong animals or some highly developed animals such as ourselves. There's no reason to think that our beliefs would be true. Evolution doesn't provide that warrant. That's a problem because, you see, the skeptic or the atheist has to come up with some objective basis for our moral values and duties if he's going to disagree with the first premise and say, oh yes, we have objective moral values and duties even though God doesn't exist. We're trying to think, how could the skeptic or the atheist come up with these? Evolution doesn't provide a clear foundation for moral ethics because evolution is designed to produce physical strength, to produce survival, not to produce true beliefs. But then another problem with this objection to our first premise is that on atheism, on evolution, which atheists believe as the alternative to creationism, according to that view, there is no intrinsic difference between human beings and animals. And so, we can dispense with human beings just as freely as we would dispense with animals. We could take our moral norms from animals. We could treat animals with exactly the same respect we customarily treat human beings with. But the point is, there is no intrinsic difference between animals and humans. And yet, there is a strong intuition in most people that human beings are to be treated differently from the way in which we would treat, say, an earthworm, or the way in which we would treat an ape, or a way in which we would treat a zebra. We might observe that moral categories do not apply to animals in the same way that they apply to humans. I mean, for example, we would observe a lion eating a zebra in the African Sahara. And we would say, here is one animal eating another animal, but we would never say that the lion had murdered the zebra. We wouldn't say that a moral category like murder or wrongful killing applied to that lion. When you watch nature shows on a channel like National Geographic or on Discovery Channel, you cannot escape how important the food chain is in the natural world. Every animal has some predator and some prey. Every animal has a strength that allows it to overcome other animals, and every animal has a weakness that allows it to be preyed upon by other animals. And if that system were not in place, then the world, our biosphere, would be very difficult indeed. We bring that up because there is killing going on all the time in the animal kingdom. There are animals who are dying, and there are animals who are living, and there are animals who are doing all sorts of different kinds of behavior. But humans do not take their moral norms from animals, nor do we ascribe praise or blame to the animals. It's been observed that by many atheistic and skeptic philosophers that there is at bottom no real difference, according to atheism, between animals and humans. Notice, for example, the words of Peter Singer, the ethicist from Princeton University, Australian ethicist. He says, "It should be obvious that the fundamental objections to racism and sexism made by Thomas Jefferson apply equally to speciesism. If possessing a higher degree of intelligence does not entitle one human to use another for his or her own ends, how can it entitle humans to exploit non-humans for the same purposes?" Notice he's saying, morally speaking, animals and humans are on the same footing. Or we might look at the words of Richard Dawkins. He says, "There exists no objective basis on which to elevate one species over another. Chimp and human, lizards and fungus, we all have evolved over some 3 billion years by a process known as natural selection. The fetus belongs to our own species and is instantly accorded special privileges and rights because of it. Whether the ethic of speciesism can be put on a logical footing any more sound than that of racism, I do not know. What I do know is that it has no proper basis in evolutionary biology. A human fetus with no more human feeling than an amoeba enjoys a reverence and legal protection far in excess of those granted to an adult chimpanzee. Yet the chimp feels and thinks." Observe what Professor Dawkins is saying. He's saying human beings are to be accorded no more rights than those of animals. And of course, he specifically mentions the human fetus. So here is one problem with the atheistic objection to the first premise. According to evolution, there is no intrinsic difference between the animal and the human. And yet it clearly seems that we should treat animals and humans differently. Also, it seems clear that we should not take our moral norms from the animals. There are those who desire to do this. For example, at Sea Life in London, they're raising a chick to be genderless. This is at the aquarium in London. And Graham McGrath, who is the general manager there, says, "While the decision may ruffle a few feathers, gender neutrality in humans has only recently become a widespread topic of conversation. However, it is completely natural for penguins to develop genderless identities as they grow into mature adults." We should notice here that penguins really are male or female. But notice the connection that's being made between the animal behavior and the human behavior. Implicit in this statement is, if animals do it, then human beings should feel free to do that as well. But notice the words of John Corvino, who is a gay rights advocate, and he is the author of a column called The Gay Moralist. And he says that this argument that animals and humans justify their behavior based on what one another do, that is, humans can justify their behavior based on what animals do, or prohibit behavior based upon what animals do not do, or vice versa, is all wrong. Here he says, even if animals did not behave homosexually, that fact would not prove that homosexuality is immoral. After all, animals don't cook their food, brush their teeth, participate in religious worship, or attend college. Human beings do all of these without moral censure. Indeed, the idea that animals could provide us with our standards, especially our sexual standards, is simply amusing. But let's go beyond just the comparison between humans and animals for a moment and notice that there is no intrinsic difference on atheism. According to evolutionary natural selection, there is no intrinsic difference between humans and even plant life. Because plants are evolved organisms, humans are evolved organisms, both are just collections of cells. One happens to be a little more highly developed than the other, but they are both in the same category of descendants from a single-celled organism that have developed based upon random, chance, naturalistic processes. And we see the outgrowth or the implications of these kinds of beliefs about animals and plants and humans in a statement such as this, which is from the Twitter feed of the Union Theological Seminary in New York, which was reporting their chapel service on September 17th, 2019. At this event, the students confessed to the plants. They approached the plants in the study and they confessed to them. They said, "Today in chapel, we confess to plants. Together, we held our grief, joy, regret, hope, guilt, and sorrow in prayer, offering them to the beings who sustain us, but whose gift we too often fail to honor. What do you confess to the plants in your life?" There's also a class at this theological seminary called Extractivism, a ritual liturgical response, where the discussion of the class is based upon the injustice done to plants by humans who extract them, and giving thanks to the plants, and so forth. So here's a real problem. Ideas like this, that plants and animals and humans are all on the same moral footing, are in great conflict not only with the Bible, but with our own moral intuitions. And so it becomes very difficult to maintain this objection to the first premise, which states that objective moral values and duties without God are not real. The atheist wants to say you can have objective moral values and duties even without God. That becomes very difficult to maintain in light of the objections that we have just shown. This is from Peter Singer, and notice what he says about the human life of the preborn and the unborn, because the preborn and the born, because both are the results of these evolutionary processes. He says the intrinsic wrongness of killing the late fetus and the intrinsic wrongness of killing the newborn infant are not markedly different. Infanticide can only be equated with abortion when those closest to the child do not want it to live. So according to atheism, no human life is intrinsically valuable, whether it's preborn or born, whether it's in the middle of life and what might be considered the most useful time of life for society, or whether it's someone who's at the end of life who may be needing more care than most people need. No human life is intrinsically valuable or worthy of our concern and respect and protection on atheism. But that runs counter to many of the moral intuitions that even atheists have. Okay, now let's shift gears and go to the second premise. Remember, the second premise of the argument says objective moral values and duties are real. But the atheist, of course, can say objective moral values and duties, objective morality, is not real. That's his claim. Of course, that's very difficult to maintain in light of the things that we've already said about our feeling that rape and other immoral actions, theft, and generally lying and people hurting innocent folks for no good reason, that those things seem to be really objectively wrong. The atheist or the skeptic might say something that goes along the lines of Richard Dawkins, who says, life has no higher purpose than to perpetuate the survival of DNA. So long as DNA is passed on, it does not matter who or what gets hurt in the process. Genes don't care about suffering because they don't care about anything. DNA neither cares nor knows. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. This universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose. Now here's the phrase we need to key in on: no evil and no good. Nothing but pitiless indifference. Or he continues elsewhere, we are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. We and all other animals are machines created by our genes. Or as Michael Roos says, who is a philosopher of science at the University of Guelph, the position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. So according to this position, where someone denies that there are objective moral values and duties, killing a poor person is on the same moral footing as helping a poor person. Being generous with people is on the same moral footing as stealing from them. Lying to someone is on the same moral footing with telling someone the truth. Murder is on the same moral plane with benevolence. But who can believe that? Not only in light of what the Bible says, but in light of our own moral intuitions. Surely we cannot live this way. Surely we cannot believe this way. So this objection to the second premise, I think, is doomed to fail for the honest observer. But of course, this is not the only way in which someone might attack the second premise by saying objective moral values and duties are not real, and so there are at bottom, no differences morally between one kind of action and another. There's no foundation for morality. There are those who would like to say, and this is just a distinction, there are those who would like to say there are moral values and duties, but rather than being objective, they are relative to the person or to his culture, and they are perhaps subjective to the individual. So there are moral values and duties, but instead of being objective, that is, objectively binding on everyone, they are relative to the subject or to his culture. In other words, a person gets to make up these values for himself, and that's as authentic a morality as we can hope for. That is the only foundation that's really available for morality. It's someone who develops a moral code that reflects his authentic self, or a moral code that reflects his own culture. So some kind of relativism where moral norms are relative to the culture, or some kind of subjectivism where moral norms are relative to the individual, that is the best foundation for morality we can hope for. But notice there are some serious difficulties with subjectivism and relativism. Just take subjectivism on the one hand, where someone says, I get to decide my own moral norms for myself based upon my own rationality. If that were true, then nobody could ever be wrong about his moral beliefs. Someone might say, oh, I believe that this particular action of stealing something that belongs to somebody else, that this is right for me. I believe it's permissible in my case because, let's say, I really need this thing or I really desire this thing that someone else has. And then you or I might disagree with the person and say, no, it's wrong to steal because you're taking something that doesn't belong to you. Can't you see the wrongness of that? You have a stark disagreement in morality. One says, I can steal. I've developed this moral norm by my own subjective reasoning. And then another person says, oh, it's wrong to steal because you're taking something that doesn't belong to you, or it's wrong to steal because God says you shouldn't. If morality is reducible to the subjective feelings or the subjective thoughts of the individuals, of each individual moral actor, then neither one could be any more right than the other. Neither thinker could be any more wrong than the other. There is no perspective from which there could be rational critique of the other that would prove successful, because morality is simply the reflection of one's own subjective beliefs on that view. So nobody could ever be wrong. Let's think about relativism, on the other hand, where moral norms are the result of cultures that have developed moral traditions. They have come together as a group with some shared beliefs, and they have produced some convictions about morality by which they live. And so certain things are right for their culture, and certain things are wrong in their culture. Other cultures may have different moral norms. Different things are right. Different combinations of things are wrong for this other culture. And sometimes cultures collide. Let's just give an example. In the early 20th century, cultural anthropologists began to do some research on the Eskimo peoples in Greenland and in the far reaches of North America, these people who live in very cold climates. And there were some surprises about some of the moral practices of the Eskimos. I don't know if these practices are still going on. I'm certainly not meaning to profile any people who are Eskimos. But when the cultural anthropologists first began to study these people, they found that they participated in wife swapping, and that they participated in killing little girls, that is, exposing them to the elements until they died, because these little girls didn't have much prospect of growing up and becoming hunters and providing food for the group, and so they presented a real hurdle for the people surviving. Same thing with old people. Old people were past the age of being able to produce as hunters or as gatherers for the people so that they would have enough to eat, and so they would expose them to the elements, and they would die. Well, this, to many people, seems like an affront to morality. In fact, people in, let's say, North America, or the part of North America in which we live, would look at what the Eskimos did and say that that's morally abhorrent. But it wasn't for the Eskimos. That was just what they did. They were used to that. That was their custom or their practice. When it was done there, it wasn't thought to be morally abhorrent. It wasn't surprising. There was nothing shocking about it. Whereas to us, those behaviors seemed like they were obviously wrong. And we might say to the Eskimos, please move to a warmer climate where you don't have to resort to those kinds of things in order to survive. And we might suggest ways that they could overcome those moral atrocities as we would see them. Here is a real problem for cultural relativism. Cultures disagree. And it seems that we should have some footing on which to critique the practices of another culture, where we could say, this is objectively wrong. What the Eskimos or what culture X did in this particular case is wrong. Furthermore, we would like to be able to critique previous generations or our own culture. We would like to be able to say, here's what our culture used to do. Here's what this culture used to do, and improvement has been made. But if cultural relativism is true, on what basis would we say that one culture doing this is better than that same culture doing something else in the past, or that one culture doing this now is any better or worse than what another culture did in the past? Remember, according to relativism, all morality is just the result of moral convention in a particular culture. And so you can't measure moral progress in a culture. You cannot say that one culture is better in doing this than it was when it did something else, or this culture is better than the other or worse than the other. No comparisons, no progress can be made. And yet it seems obvious to us that a violation of logical reasoning occurs when someone says, person or culture X believes this, person or culture Y believes the opposite, and both of them are right. That's a violation of one of the fundamental rules of logic, which is a precisely stated proposition must be either true or false. Or a given moral action could be right or it could be wrong but it cannot be both at the same time. That would just be logically incoherent. And so here is the problem for this objection for our second premise. The second premise of our moral argument says objective moral values and duties are real. If someone's going to object to that, they're going to have to say that maybe there are moral values and duties in some sense, but they're just either the imaginations of our evolutionary brains that have reached the point where they can express themselves in moral terms and do some self-reflection, but there's really nothing to it beyond chemical reactions that help us to survive. Or people are going to have to say, oh, there are moral values and duties, but instead of being objective, they are the constructs of the individual, or they are the constructs of the culture. And none of those explanations, as we have seen, is satisfactory. Then I want to address one objection to our making our moral conventions, our moral beliefs, grounded in God, and that is that objective moral values and duties cannot be grounded in God at all. And this is because of what atheistic and skeptical philosophers, ethicists will call a dilemma for Christian theists. They'll say there is a dilemma called the Euthyphro Dilemma, which is taken from one of Plato's dialogues called the Euthyphro, and it goes like this. Why is anything good? Is a good thing good because God says it's good, or is a good thing good because is it good because God says it's good, or is it just good, period? Good in virtue of itself. If we say that a good thing is good because God says it is, well, then God might have been arbitrary in making that choice. God said that helping the poor was good, but he could have just as easily said hurting the poor is good. If we say that a good thing is good just because it is good, independent of God, well, then God has been removed from the equation of developing our moral convictions, and we don't need God at all. So you get what is supposed to be the dilemma for Christians. On the one hand, if you say that a good thing is good just because God chose it, well, how do we know that God made the right choice? That God perhaps wasn't just being arbitrary or perhaps flipping some kind of cosmic coin to determine what's right and wrong. On the other hand, if good things are good just because they are good and God happened to point them out to us, then we don't really need God to explain why anything is good at all. And God is no longer necessary as a feature of our moral reasoning. But of course, this is not really a dilemma at all, because there is a third possibility, and that is that good is good in virtue of God's nature. That God was not being arbitrary when he told us what was valuable, what was right or wrong. When God said this is the whole of man to keep God's commandments, Ecclesiastes 12 and 13. Or when God said, you shall love the Lord with all your heart and soul and mind, Matthew 22 verses 37 to 39. When God told us that our life should be oriented around seeking the kingdom of God, Matthew 6 and verse 33. When God gave us these moral commands, he was not being arbitrary. He was reflecting his own divine nature, which is the foundation not just of morality, but of everything else that exists. And so the Euthyphro Dilemma, which is so often given, for example, at the beginning of college ethics courses, where the teacher will get up and say something like this, and I've heard this said, the teacher will say, some people like to say that right and wrong is determined by God. But that doesn't make any sense because of what we read in Plato's Euthyphro dialogue. And then he explains the dilemma, and it's supposed to pose a real problem for Christians. But it doesn't, because goodness, rightness, is grounded in God's very nature. So what do we conclude from all of these things that we've said about the moral argument? Remember, the moral argument says, if God exists, or rather, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties are not real. They are illusory. And then the second premise is, objective moral values and duties are real, and the conclusion is, therefore, God exists. If the premises are true, then the conclusion is true, and the skeptics are wrong. However much they might want to deny it, or however slow some people are to come to believe in the existence of God, if we have good arguments for God's existence, then we can know that God exists. And we have three good arguments for his existence. We have the cosmological argument, or the argument that's based upon the existence of anything at all. Then we have the teleological argument, which is based upon the design of the things that have come into existence. And then we have the moral argument, which we've been discussing today. And if these arguments are persuasive, and they are, then we have good reason to believe that God exists and for thinking that the skeptics' claim is actually false. But then I want to conclude by making one other observation, and that is, if the atheists or the skeptics are right and God does not exist, then life is actually absurd. That is, life is ultimately meaningless, because we are just some collection of cells and tissues and organs that live on a tiny speck of dust in a meaningless universe that was totally unplanned, that has no goal or aim, is just the result of accidents, that may be the result of what might be termed an explosion in space. And when we die, there will be nothing left of us. And when the universe reaches either its heat death or its freezing death, there will be nothing left other than what remains as the cold and lifeless corpse of a universe that once was cohering but now is just drifting apart into space. And there will be no mind, no consciousness, no decisions to be made, no value whatsoever. That's the outlook of atheism. Skepticism and atheism says you cannot know any ultimate meaning or purpose for your life. You can ascribe some purposes to it, but you have no way of knowing if those purposes are actually good or real or have any actual bearing on how things are. In fact, you might, according to them, have good reason for thinking there is no purpose or meaning to it whatsoever. But even beyond that, if atheism is true, there is no punishment for the wicked, there is no reward for the righteous. And that makes our moral lives very fragile in society. I might just bring up the quote of Fyodor Dostoevsky, who in his novel, The Brothers Karamazov, said, "If there is no immortality, then all things are permitted." What a scary thought, to think of a world where people feel no conscience about doing evil things because there's no punishment ultimately for people who do those things. Let's read one quote along these lines. This is from Richard Wurmbrand, who was imprisoned in a Soviet communist prison for 10 years and tortured. This was in Romania. And he said after this experience in a book that he wrote called Tortured for Christ, "The cruelty of atheism is hard to believe when man has no faith in the reward of good or the punishment of evil. There is no reason to be human. There is no restraint from the depths of evil which is in man. The communist torturers often said, if there is no God, they said, there is no God, no hereafter, no punishment for evil. We can do what we wish. I have heard one torturer even say, I thank God, in whom I don't believe, that I have lived to this hour when I can express all the evil in my heart. He expressed it in unbelievable brutality and torture inflicted on prisoners." If atheism is correct, then that torturer was correct in saying that there was no penalty, nothing really for him to ultimately worry about in committing the atrocities that he did. We're so thankful to be serving a God who proposes a different way, who proposes Christian love and benevolence toward everyone, who says that the end of your life, the purpose of your existence on this planet, is to be in a right relationship with God, and therefore, to the best of your ability, to be in a right relationship with your fellow man, to be a son or a daughter of the divine King of heaven, and to be a faithful brother or sister to your fellow man. That's the goal of everyone, and I trust that's your goal. And if we can be of any assistance in helping you to become more like God or to be faithful to Christ, then we are at your service. Thank you for being present for this presentation.